topic is the history of the African American in Nashville between 1780 and 1930. And the author of the history is Dr. Bobby Lovett, the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Tennessee State University. Of course, Dr. Lovett, before we had our first commercial break, you were giving us an overview in reference to some of the things that you covered in this book. And let's continue that conversation and have you to sort of enlighten our audience during this segment of some of the things that they probably don't know about Nashville, Tennessee, and et cetera, and about African Americans in Nashville, that will make this book a part of their library and a part of the resources and a source instrument for them.
Right. Well, again, as I said, about 22% of African Americans were free in Nashville during slavery times, and another 25% were what we call hired slaves. And they could be hired out for $100 to $150 a year. Well, today people say, well, that's not a lot of money. It was a lot of money then. The average person back in that day and time would probably realize not even $100 in cash money in 1 year. So for a slave master or owner to have a person go out and earn $150 and they could take all of it or most of it was quite an investment. But African Americans were in demand as workers because, remember, this was a frontier city. And by the 1840s, Nashville was grown into quite a city, you know. There are steamboats. By 1851, of course, there are railroads being built to connect the city to the outside world. There are many businesses that are serving the agricultural sector here in Middle Tennessee. And also businesses like shipping that is serving the iron industry. Iron mines were operated all the way from Dixon County all the way up to the plateau, up to Kentucky. And about 10,000 slaves worked in those iron mines. And we call those the iron slaves. They took the ore and smelted it, just as they had done in Africa 600 years ago. They, of course, turned the iron into pots, into pans, into stoves, and other iron products, tools that people needed. And that was a big industry for Nashville and in Middle Tennessee. But in Nashville, the African Americans did all kinds of work. Almost all of the barbers were African American in Nashville. And that was a pretty lucrative industry back in that day and time. They consisted of, they made up 85% of all the skilled trades in the South in that particular day and time. So they were the carpenters, they were the bricklayers, the stone cutters, the stone layers, they were the coopers who made barrels, they made wagons, they were the shoemakers. Sarah Esdale, for example, owned the only ice cream shop which was on Church Street during that day and time. The bakers downtown were African Americans. When you had to go get your cakes and your pies for Christmas and so on, then they had to go to African Americans who made those particular products. The only pharmacist in town was owned by a slave who was hired out by his master. His name was Jack. And they called him Jack the Root Doctor because all of the medicines that he had were from roots and herbs, and he was very knowledgeable of those particular roots and herbs that you could use for mending the body. So most of his customers were not African Americans, but of course most of his customers were the whites in town, but they depended upon him. And his shop was on Church Street. And if you went to what today is 4th and Charlotte Avenue, that was the corner that African Americans dominated as the hack service or hack business. In other words, today we call it the taxi service.
Very good.
But all of the hack drivers in town were African Americans. And if you stayed in the business and hustle, you could become quite wealthy. So free Negroes dominated that trade, but also some slave masters let their slaves hire out as hack drivers because they also could earn a lot of money if the slaves brought the money home to them.
And so they had a system that, and that's something that we generally don't think about in terms of the slave, because I think in many instances when we see slavery, or we think of slavery, we think of slaves in the cotton fields or in cane fields and et cetera. So what you're telling us now here is that in Nashville, that you have personally identified a large number of areas and large number of activities. Is that what we're saying here?
That is not agriculture because urban slavery ultimately evolved into something totally different than plantation and farm slavery. And so there were all kinds of ordinary jobs that African Americans had in town as opposed to out in the countryside. Give you one example. A slave woman by the name of Sally Thomas, who was born in 1790, died in 1850. Her master allowed her to hire out her time because two of the boys that Sally had were the master's sons. And Sally set up a boarding house where the Radisson or the Doubletree Hotel is located today. And she took the top part of that house and rented it out for roomers who came to the General Assembly, you know, and they stayed at Sally's house. She was a boarder. Downstairs, of course, she ran a laundry to wash their clothes and so on. In the front room, her boys, they cut hair because African Americans dominated the barbering business. And so the Thomas family became quite prosperous. One of the boys left town and moved to St. Louis, where he died in 1913. And he owned a whole string of barbershops in St. Louis. He even owned real estate in Nashville before he left here in 1856. Another one of her sons left and moved to Alabama, where he became a large real estate dealer and a barber. And his grandson became the first African-American congressman from the state of Alabama in 1872 after slavery. So there was the opportunity for slaves to accumulate wealth in the city as opposed, of course, to living out in the countryside.
Dr. BLovett, as we make preparations for this second commercial break, we've got about a minute before that, but let me, since you're talking about how skilled these individuals are in giving us all this surprising information, when you think about all of these antebellum homes that you see, and since you mentioned that African Americans were involved in the crafts and building, et cetera, you see a Hermitage plantation or a bale mead plantation. Did African Americans have anything to do with the construction of this, or did you identify what they were able to do? And when we come back, we're getting ready for this commercial break, but when we come back, we want you to bring together the information that you have from this book dealing with what they were able to do and how they were able to be involved in some of these large projects. Because I think the general impression is that while they might have been there, they really didn't build the bale meads and the other, they didn't have anything to do with that. And that's what we want to do, I think, because I think that here you covered that quite extensively, we know, and so we want you to do that. And of course, we'll do that when we come back for this final segment, and we'll be back with you following this short commercial break. To the Dean of the